The following is a presentation prepared by the U.S. General Services Administration on the draft supplemental environmental impact statement for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Consolidation at St. Elizabeth's West Campus, Master Plan Amendment 2. The General Services Administration is the lead agency for this proposed action. The Department of Homeland Security and the National Capital Planning Commission are cooperating agencies in this effort. My name is Marshall Popkin, and I am the GSA Environmental Compliance Specialist for the Master Plan Amendment 2. We thank you for taking the time to view this presentation and welcome your comments and feedback on the proposed Master Plan Amendment 2. Also presenting on behalf of GSA are Otto Condon with ZGF Architects and Joan Glynn from Stantec Consulting Services, Inc., our environmental consultant. In carrying out our environmental and cultural resource compliance responsibilities, the GSA is committed to ensuring that we provide proper consideration to the quality of the natural and human environment. This is an important opportunity for you to provide your comments on the draft EIS for the Master Plan Amendment 2. This presentation describes the processes for complying with the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, commonly referred to as NEPA, and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. We will explain the action proposed by GSA and its purpose and need. We will then give a brief overview of the proposed alternatives for the Master Plan Amendment 2, and finally, we will provide an overview of the potential environmental impacts from these alternatives. Instructions on how to comment on the draft EIS are provided at the end of the presentation. GSA is preparing a master plan amendment to guide future development for the DHS headquarters at St. Elizabeth's West Campus. This is the second amendment to the St. Elizabeth's West Campus Master Plan, which was originally approved in 2008 and was first amended in 2012. The processes for Master Plan Amendment 2 approval, NEPA compliance, and Section 106 compliance are being conducted concurrently. The draft Master Plan Amendment 2, along with a draft Transportation Management Plan, have been submitted to the National Capital Planning Commission and other local and regional agencies for their review and comment. GSA, with input from DHS, has prepared a draft EIS in accordance with the requirements of NEPA. NEPA is the nation's legislative charter for protection of the environment and provides for the consideration of environmental issues in federal agency planning and decision-making. NEPA requires GSA to prepare an EIS when a proposed action may significantly impact the quality of the natural and human environment. An EIS informs agency decision makers and the public about the potential environmental impacts of implementing the alternatives for the proposed action, including the no action alternative. The NEPA process for this master plan amendment began when GSA published a notice of intent to prepare an EIS in the Federal Register on November 19, 2018. Since then, GSA, with input from DHS and the National Capital Planning Commission as cooperating agencies, has collected and analyzed data, developed alternatives, and assessed potential impacts of the proposed Master Plan Amendment 2. During this time, we have continued to consult with the public and other local and federal government agencies in order to develop the draft EIS. The draft EIS was issued to the public and to regulatory agencies for comment beginning on May 8, 2020. Due to the ongoing impacts of COVID-19, GSA has extended the normal 45-day public comment period to a 70-day comment period that will end on July 16, 2020. By the fall of this year, GSA plans to release the final EIS to the public for a period of 30 days before making a final decision, at which point GSA will publish a record of decision. A record of decision is a public document that contains a statement of the decision made on the alternative selected for implementation and the applicable monitoring and enforcement plan for mitigation adopted for the project. Section 106 requires that federal agencies consider the effects of their actions on any district, site, building, structure, or object listed in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Section 106 review ensures that preservation values are factored into federal agency planning and decisions. Concurrent with the NEPA process, GSA has initiated consultation under Section 106. Section 106 requires that GSA provide the public, agencies, and other interested parties the opportunity to comment on GSA actions impacting historic resources. GSA is integrating the public involvement processes for Section 106 in NEPA. Though comments on the draft EIS are due by July 16th, comments on the Section 106 process will be accepted throughout GSA's consultation with the DC Historic Preservation Office. GSA is currently consulting with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the DC Historic Preservation Office, and other consulting parties. GSA is working to execute a memorandum of agreement with the Advisory Council and the DC Historic Preservation Office. The memorandum of agreement will outline a series of measures to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential adverse impacts of the Master Plan Amendment 2 on cultural resources. Within the regulatory framework described in the last few slides, GSA is proposing to implement an amendment to the St. Elizabeth's West Campus Master Plan to eliminate development on the East Campus and reevaluate development on the West Campus to accommodate 4.1 million gross square feet of secure office and shared use space and 1.6 million gross square feet of associated parking on the West Campus only. The purpose for this proposed action is to support the continued consolidation of the DHS headquarters offices at the West Campus. The proposed action is needed for efficiency, to reflect the current condition of the historic buildings, to reduce costs, and to accelerate completion of the DHS consolidation.
Hello, this is Otto Condon with ZGF Architects. The action alternatives focus on building on the plateau site of the West Campus, as well as impacts of constructing a facility on the Sweetgum Lane site on the western side of the West Campus. Planners and architects took into consideration St. Elizabeth's status as a National Historic Landmark, use to and from the plateau site and the Sweetgum Lane site, natural resources including steep slopes, geology of the sites, forested areas, the bald eagle management zone, and contamination on the campus, primarily from fly ash buried on the site in the 1960s and 70s. Under the action alternatives, an additional 535 employee parking spaces would be provided on the West Campus, resulting in a 1-to-4 parking ratio. The new parking spaces would be added to the previously proposed underground parking garages at gates 1 and at gate 2 on the east side of the West Campus. GSA has proposed 2 alternatives for accommodating the proposed development on the West Campus. Under Alternative A, 1.2 million gross square feet of office space would be constructed in 3 separate office structures, configured around 2 open courtyards on the plateau site, resulting in a campus setting that correlates to the organization of the historic buildings on the West Campus. Building heights would likely be designed to reach between 3 and 8 stories. Building A1 would be stepped down into the ravine near the buildings 56-57 to stabilize the slope in that area. Building 56-57 would be integrated into the design of Building A1 to provide a connection between the historic and new construction. Under Alternative A, 175,000 gross square feet of office space would be constructed on the Sweetgum Lane site and would include some below grade and some above grade construction. Under Alternative B, 1.2 million gross square feet of office space would be constructed in 2 separate office structures configured around 2 enclosed courtyards. Building heights would likely be designed to reach between 3 and 8 stories. Building B1 would be stepped down to the ravine, and Building 56-57 would be integrated into the design of Building B1 in the same manner as Building A1 in Alternative A. As with Alternative A, under Alternative B, 175,000 gross square feet of office space would be constructed on the Sweet Gum Lane site. The impacts for each of the alternatives are assessed by comparing conditions under each alternative to the conditions under the no action alternative, which is used as the baseline. Under the no action alternative, GSA would develop the West Campus as described in the West Campus Master Plan approved by NCPC on January 8, 2009. The development would provide 1.1 million gross square feet of office and related space on the Plateau site, with no development on the Sweet Gum Lane site, and would result in a total of 3.8 million gross square feet of office and related space on the West Campus.
Hi, this is Joan Glenn with Stantec. Each of the alternatives studied in the draft EIS would result in impacts to the human environment. The EIS assesses direct impacts that would occur at the same time and place as the proposed action, indirect impacts that would occur later in time or are further removed for distance but still reasonably foreseeable, and cumulative impacts that result from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable actions. The draft EIS characterizes impacts by the severity of the impact. The EIS uses 4 intensity thresholds: negligible, minor, moderate, and major. The type of impact describes the beneficial or adverse nature of the impact. The duration of the impact considers how long the impacts are expected to last. Context refers to whether impacts are site-specific, local, or regional. To assess the potential environmental impacts under each alternative, we collected and analyzed information on a wide range of resource categories. None of the alternatives would impact geologic features on the West Campus. The no action alternative would not impact the topography of the West Campus, while alternatives A and B would include construction of a pedestrian connection from the bottom to the top of the ravine that would reduce the existing slope in that area. Clearing, grading, and excavation of soils would be required for the construction of the proposed buildings. Alternative A and B would impact soils on steep slopes in the ravine. However, locating the proposed building in the ravine would help to stabilize the slopes in that area. Under all the alternatives, construction of underground portions of the buildings could intercept the perch groundwater table and springs, and have potential groundwater infiltration into new buildings. Impervious surfaces on the West Campus would be increased, which would affect groundwater recharge. None of the alternatives would directly impact surface waters. Sediment and erosion controls would minimize stormwater runoff and potential water quality degradation during construction. Long-term stormwater management controls would mitigate the effects from runoff from increases in impervious surfaces. Thorough design planning and engineering measures would ensure that new buildings do not experience water infiltration. Each of the alternatives would require the removal of vegetation, including specimen trees. The no action alternative would not affect vegetation on the Sweet Gum Lane site. All the alternatives would have long-term beneficial impacts with the establishment of new landscaping. Wildlife on the West Campus would be affected by displacement and noise during construction. Once construction is complete, there would be a permanent loss of wildlife habitat, including the loss of habitat for migratory birds. No protected wildlife or vegetation species would be affected by any of the alternatives. The St. Elizabeth's West Campus is a National Historic Landmark. The NHL designation covers 82 contributing resources on the East and West campuses, including buildings, landscapes, vistas of the river and city, and cemeteries. Under the no action alternative, no buildings would be demolished. Buildings would have alterations and additions to meet current office and shared use needs. These changes would have a direct, long-term, moderate adverse impact on the historic fabric of the buildings, but rehabilitation of contributing buildings would overall result in beneficial impacts. Under alternatives A and B, buildings 52, 56, 57, and 64 would be retained, but would need alterations and additions to meet current office and shared use needs. Buildings 60, 66, 67, 68, and 69 on the plateau, and Building 15 on the Sweet Gum Lane site would be demolished. Demolition of buildings would have direct, long-term, major adverse impacts on the NHL. Rehabilitation of buildings would have direct, long-term, moderate, adverse impacts on the historic fabric of the buildings, but rehabilitation of contributing buildings would overall result in beneficial impacts. Under all of the alternatives, construction on the plateau would alter the overall setting. feeling and association of the West Campus as a residential facility. The construction of new buildings and removal of trees would result in direct, long-term major adverse impacts to the St. Elizabeth's cultural landscape. Additionally, all the alternatives would have direct, long-term minor to major adverse impacts to views and vistas within and outside of the West Campus. All the alternatives are compatible with the federal and district elements of the comprehensive plan for the National Capital and with other plans and initiatives that apply to the areas surrounding the West Campus. Additionally, the alternatives are consistent with the land use and zoning of the West Campus. Under all alternatives, a few employees may move to the communities surrounding the West Campus and have a negligible impact on housing availability. None of the alternatives would result in disproportionate direct adverse impacts to low-income populations, minority residents, the elderly, or children. The no action alternative and alternatives A and B would have effects on the communities surrounding the West Campus, including impacts to air quality, noise, and transportation system. With the proposed mitigation, impacts to minority and low-income populations would not be discernible. Removal of hazardous materials under the no action alternative would result in beneficial impacts to environmental conditions and human health. However, these benefits may not be detectable in the communities outside the West Campus. Expenditure of federal funds on construction under all the alternatives would result in direct employment opportunities, and from this employment increase, the economy would gain payroll earnings, which in turn would spur secondary employment opportunities. Federal properties are not subject to real property taxes, and therefore property taxes would not be collected for the West Campus. However, there would be beneficial impacts to taxes and revenues because there would be a slight increase in sales tax revenues from the purchase of construction materials and in income taxes paid by construction workers. No community services or facilities would be relocated or disrupted under any of the analyzed alternatives. The increase in personnel located on the West Campus could result in an increased demand for police, fire, and EMT services. The no action alternative and alternatives A and B would result in direct, short-term, minor adverse impacts from temporary exhaust emissions from fuel combustion in motor vehicles and construction equipment, and fugitive particulate matter emissions from soil disturbance, earthwork, and other construction activities. There would be no new stationary sources of emissions from long-term operation of new facilities under any of the alternatives. Potential adverse mobile source air toxics from vehicle emissions under alternatives A and B would not be greater than those analyzed in Master Plan Amendment 1. Under the action alternatives, total volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide emissions would be below the applicable de minimis thresholds, and the alternatives would conform with the Clean Air Act. Under all the alternatives, noise would be generated from demolition and construction activities, and from increased traffic associated with operation of the new facilities. Overall, noise increases from traffic would be imperceptible and negligible under the no action alternative and alternatives A and B. The alternatives would result in short-term, minor adverse impacts during construction from noise associated with the operation of construction equipment, and there would be long-term negligible adverse impacts from the operation of the completed facilities. Under the no action alternative and alternatives A and B, committed transportation projects would noticeably improve the operations in the overall transportation system in the vicinity of the West Campus. Levels of service would worsen at several intersections due to increased traffic under alternatives A and B. And through traffic on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue Southeast and Firth Sterling Avenue Southeast would worsen under the proposed action. Turning lane improvements are proposed on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue Southeast to improve access into the West Campus and to reduce the impact on through traffic. Under the no action alternative and alternatives A and B, utility lines for electricity, natural gas, water, and sanitary sewer would be replaced and extended to the Plateau site. New lines would be installed to the Sweet Gum Lane site under alternatives A and B. Operation of the new facilities under all the alternatives would create a slight but detectable increase in the demand for utilities. Under all alternatives, construction and operation of new facilities would increase the volume of solid waste requiring disposal from the West Campus. Alternatives A and B would result in larger amounts of solid waste from demolition of buildings on the plateau and construction of a new facility on the Sweet Gum Lane site. Once operational, solid waste generated within the plateau site and Sweet Gum Lane site would be collected by private hauling services and sorted for recycling and landfill disposal. construction and operational wastes are not anticipated to affect waste haulers or the capacity of landfills. Hazardous materials such as lead-based paint and asbestos would be removed from buildings to be demolished under each of the alternatives. Construction activities under each alternative would also require the excavation of contaminated soils containing fly ash, particularly as it relates to each alternative for building A1. Hazardous materials and contaminated soils and water would be disposed of at an EPA-approved landfill. The removal of contaminants would improve environmental conditions and reduce the potential for human health impacts, resulting in beneficial impacts.
Hi, this is Marshall Popkin once again with GSA. This concludes the discussion of the impacts of the proposed Master Plan Amendment 2. Copies of the draft EIS are available at www.gsa.gov/NCR-NEPA. As previously stated, we are in the midst of the 70-day public comment period for the draft EIS, which will end on July 16, 2020. We encourage you to provide comments on environmental issues you believe were not addressed or were not adequately addressed in the draft EIS. Please note that comments expressing an opinion about the project itself are not considered a substantive comment relative to the potential environmental impacts and therefore will not be addressed in the final EIS. To provide comments, you may email them to Mr. Paul Gyamfi at paul.gyamfi@gsa.gov or mail comments to attention Mr. Paul Gyamfi, Public Buildings Service, National Capital Region, U.S. General Services Administration, 1800 F Street, Northwest, room 4400, Washington, D.C. 20407. An online comment form is also available at http://www.stelizabethdevelopment.com/NEPA.html. This concludes today's presentation.